Hello, my name is Bob Brown, and it's my privilege to host this show, which is based on the reality that Westboro is a great town filled with interesting people. Many of them are long-term residents who have so many memories and stories about life in Westboro in days gone past. And so your local cable station, Westboro TV, has initiated this series of programs which are designed to reflect upon life in earlier days and to possibly make suggestions about how we can improve life in this fine town for the future. There are many stories in Westboro that are important for us to know about. This is one of the big ones. Westboro was a leader in something that it didn't understand what it was doing, but it became the pioneer of working with juvenile delinquents and providing housing for them, which was separate from the jail system. When our forefathers came to this land, they brought with them the British judicial system, which had no distinction between youth and adult. In the 1820s, as the farmers moved more into the city to make a living, more and more kids became street kids because the parents were working and the kids were just free to be on the streets, and that caused the problem of delinquency to increase dramatically in this country. To solve that problem, to provide housing for them, the almshouses sponsored by churches and other religious groups were built to take in these wayward kids and to keep them off the street. Eventually that problem became too big for just these small private organizations to handle, and the state was forced with the responsibility of deciding what they would do with these now called delinquent kids. Now, before we go any further with that conversation, we need to understand that the delinquent in those days, as it was up until the 1950s, was considered to be any child who just the court felt was unable to be handled. So that the offenses could run from being a stubborn child, not obeying their parents, to hooking school, to running away, or conversely to killing their grandmother. So there's a wide range of offenses that were called delinquent. Today, a delinquent child is a child who, if he or she commits an offense which is punishable by being sent to prison as an adult, is considered a delinquent. So that eliminates the category of stubborn children, runaways, and truants, and those sorts of things. When the almshouses couldn't handle all the kids, the state was forced to face the problem of what they were going to do. And what we're standing in front of now is the solution to that particular problem. This was called the State Reform School for Boys. It was designed to be, theoretically, a cottage-type system. The philosophy was that if you could put a kid in a family that was stable and able to teach values and teach the work ethic, that you would turn out a child who was able to be a productive citizen. Conversely, if a child didn't have that kind of background, he or she would most likely become what was called a delinquent. So the idea was to create a cottage system. Somehow, this idea of a cottage system turned into this organization here. Look at the size of this building. This was the very first state reform school built in this country for the purpose of providing the cottage-type system. Now, obviously, we're talking and being a bit facetious here because there's nothing cottage about this. The population in this building grew to be 643 kids. And it was a building which eventually became so overused from 1848 up until the 1880s, that it had many problems that were unable to be handled by the staff that was here. The kids really ended up running the place. And as a result of that, there was a very severe fire. When that happened, they had to have some other place to put the kids. And so they purchased two sailing ships. One was anchored in Boston Harbor, the other was in New Bedford. And those were ships that were supposedly taking kids to sea. The idea was, theoretically, to give them some nautical experience, but the reality was just to get them out of here. If you sent them to sea, then you didn't have to worry about them, they were gone. The ships never sailed themselves. They were used to indenture. And the remarkable part of this is that we have the records of all those kids who were indentured onto those prison ships, those nautical ships, as well as all the other kids who ever came into these facilities. Those records are now stored in the state archives, which are located on Columbia Point, down in Boston. So it's a very fascinating history. And it lasted here from the 1848 until 1888, at which point another facility was built, which we'll visit shortly. With me today is Glenn Parker, known to many folks in town. Glenn is an ex-police chief in town and done a great deal of work on the history of the town, the railroads, the trolley lines, the highways, and the Lyman School and the State Reform School. So I want him to have an opportunity to talk to you a little bit about what he knows. He's done a lot of research on this, then he'll fill you in on the things that I have failed to mention right now about the reformatory. And then as we go over to the Lyman School grounds, we can talk more about what he knows about that facility. Anything you want to add, Glenn?
Thank you very much. As Bob said, it was called the State Reform School for Boys at Westboro, and it was neither a reform school nor was it a training center or an educational facility. Boys were dropped off here literally at the front door and left for any number of offenses that they may have committed at home or on the streets. And this is just a small representation of the buildings that were built here of this style. You can see that it spreads all the way down to behind Bob. It's behind us, and it's over on the other streets. Some of the original buildings that were here when it was called the Peters Farm became superintendent's office, or, as Bob mentioned, cottages. Now, they weren't cottages, actually. They were congregations of people. And inside of this building, there was a teaching classrooms, there was cafeterias, there was workshops. There was a jail, an actual jail cells that the boys were put into. There were dormitories where the boys slept in bunk beds. And unfortunately, they were all put together, ages 17 all the way to 21. And so there was a great deal of interaction between the older boys and the younger boys, and you can imagine what I'm saying, that the older boys were pretty much in charge, and they took advantage of the younger boys. And so this was one of the issues that transpired during this operation between the 1880s, between the 1840s and the 1880s. Most of the staff, unfortunately, were uneducated people, but they had an interest in trying to help young boys. Many of them came from the provinces in Canada, and they lived here. It was a 24/7 operation. They never went anywhere. They stayed right on the grounds. And so they were the mother and the father to many of these young boys. And that's the way it remained all the way into the late 60s. So there's a vast and a very rich history here, not only with the buildings, but more importantly with the boys that were here that went through the system. And so we hope to educate some people into what actually happened here and how the boys survived and what was their history. So with that, this is Reform School, the State Reform School for Boys at Westboro.
And as it turned out, this model became one that was transported all across the country because it all began here, the whole idea of separating the youthful offender from the adult inmate. Remember the ages now we're talking about, as Glenn has indicated, you could come as young as 7 and you could stay until you're 21. So that it was a wild mix of people. And the model, as you'll guess, didn't work because of 1, overcrowding, 2, lack of qualified staff and numbers of staff necessary to manage kids who were difficult kids in the beginning. So the transition from this to the Lyman School became necessary. So many of the ideas that the legislature and the trustees had were great on paper, but never really fulfilled with the money needed to make this thing work. The prime leader, and we'll discover more about him when we go over to the next facility, was Colonel Lyman, a very well-to-do Boston merchant who had had worldwide experience and felt very deeply about how kids should be managed who were delinquent kids, and really felt that they could be salvaged. He was one of few who believed that. Many people felt that they just couldn't be salvaged. Part of that was the reflection of what this is all about. We can't see it now from this particular point, But the courtyard, which is in the middle of all these buildings, completely surrounds it, and that became the area that was secure. You couldn't get out of there. So you could take kids out there occasionally for recreation and to have some fun in the yard. But the curious part of it was the building was so constructed that the light never shone into the courtyard. The sun never got in there. You see, we're in an easterly reflection now. These towers prohibit the sun from getting into the yard. The majority of people who in those days thought of kids as being delinquent also thought of them as being devil-possessed. These were kids who should be separated from the society and kept apart. Thus, many of them were Boston kids. Look how far we are from Boston and how they had to go to get here. Long distances. There's some interesting stories about that, and we're not going to belabor that at this particular point, but I can remember the story of one young man who was sentenced by the court to the reformatory. They put him on a trolley, and he came out to the station out here, and he was told to walk up the hill. He didn't know where he was. He walked up the hill, knocked on the front door, and spent the rest of his juvenile days locked up in here. That doesn't happen anymore. So I think we'll go over to the Lyman School now. Is that right?
That sounds great.
Okay. Thank you. All right, now we're on the site of the Lyman School for Boys. The name Lyman, again, was attached to a well-to-do merchant in Boston who felt very strongly about how delinquent kids should be managed. And the reason his name appears on the facility is that he was one of the chief benefactors who made it possible for this to be built. As I said before, the legislature was good at making rules, but very poor at funding them. So they voted to move away from the old reformatory and to come over here to this hill to build truly the cottage type system, to finally try to see if that would work. They didn't appropriate enough money for that, so Colonel Lyman provided the remainder of the money to build the beginning of this facility. He didn't want his name attached to it, but whether he wanted it or not, they did. And it became known as the Lyman School for Boys. We are standing now on the road which led to the school from what is now known as Route 9. Glenn has done a great deal of research about this particular area, so I'm going to let him tell you about how kids came to this school.
In front of us and behind the cameraman is what we call today Route 9, or the Boston-Worcester Turnpike. Well, it was only here in 1930 that this became a concreted four-lane highway. Prior to that, the layout, which occurred in 1810, was no more than a cart path wide, a dirt road, actually 21 feet wide, that went from Newton to Worcester. This was the main east to west route between Boston and Worcester. The straightest line, the fastest way to get to Boston and Worcester. And it wasn't until 1901 that the trolley was built along this same road, and across the street at Park Street there was a station. And the kids were brought in from Boston or Worcester or points north and south to this area, to the trolley station, dropped off there, and they were marched up the hill. And as you can see behind us is what we call the Maples Cottage. Well, now it's part of the Spectrum facility. But back then, in 1884, 85, it was called the Bella Stone Farm. And it was purchased by the state in 1886, along with a very large building that stood here on this empty lot, called the Wesson Tavern. The Wesson Tavern was built in 1825 and went through a number of uses. But in 1885, it was purchased by the state and became what was known as the Wesson Cottage. And it remained there until 1952, when it was taken down. Behind us is just the beginning of what is now the Lyman School for Boys.
In 1959, I was appointed as the Protestant chaplain here. I was the first one here as a full-time chaplain since Phillips Brooks was here as a chaplain, and that was back in the 1800s. This was the administration building. Over this side, we'll just take a swing around. This rather big building over here was the storeroom, the carpenter shop, the print shop, and the laundry room, all in that building, and all of that was operated by kids. Much of the printing that was done here was done for the state welfare department. We have a lot of that printing that's still available to show you the quality of the work that those kids, those were all hand-laid or hand-set print presses. So you had to have some kids who could spell and understood how to do things manually. Around to the left side over here, Tim, this was the power plant and the heating plant. If you came here in the wintertime, you could tell exactly where the heat ran in this facility. All the grass would continue to grow over the tunnels which carried the heat to all the buildings on this grounds. These were tunnels that were hand dug by kids, stone lined, and you could walk through all of them. But the power plant was the source of the heat. Further down, where the visitor sign is, that was called Elms Cottage. That is now taken over by Spectrum, and it's a drug rehab facility. But in those days, it was the cottage for the older boys. Just beyond this building, the white one here, was the infirmary, which was put on the site of the original church in Westboro. We'll go over there and take a look at that site. Up here behind the trees was another building, which was the building I was in, which was eventually became the chaplain's building, and the band building, where the band practiced on the second floor. In the basement was the cafeteria or the kitchen, and when they began to move food from to the cottages, they would prepare the food there and then truck it around to all the individual cottages. We'll talk about that in a little bit in a moment. But that's this corner of the institution. Now we're talking about a large piece of ground here. We're talking about over 500 acres of land upon which this facility is built. And it became very confusing to a lot of people. It looked very attractive. It was well kept. The kids hand mowed the whole facility by hand with hand lawnmowers. They planted gardens. They took care of all the grounds. They painted. They did a lot of the repair work. So it was a very respectable looking facility. And people who would be coming along not knowing what this was would see the sign down on Route 9 and would think it was a prep school and would come in and talk about how they could get their kids enrolled here. And I'd have to tell them, at that particular point I was in the administration of the school, I'd have to tell them that probably our standards were a little difficult for their kids to qualify for and just discourage them from coming.
And the unusual thing about the grounds, there are no fences, there are no walls, there was no security guards walking the property. This was wide open space. And we used to drive through here as residents, and I drove through here often as a policeman without anyone interfering with your presence here. So that it wasn't a facility that looked like a jail or a barred facility. It wasn't. And that's what was unusual about this also.
Glenn's making an excellent point, and I failed to mention this. We're going to see a lot of cottages or cottage sites as we go around. The cottage was an idea of really doing what the original legislature wanted to do of the cottage type system. The system was to hire a husband and wife who would be cottage master and matron. And into that cottage you would insert 20 to 25 kids who would be their family. In the beginning, everything happened in the cottage. School took place there. The chores were done there. Some were sent out occasionally to work on the farm, but the bulk of the life of the school was in the cottage. Eventually, as time went on, that all changed. It became impossible to hire couples to work with kids, and so you had to hire people on shifts. You no longer could hire people for a 24-hour day, 7-day a week. The 48-hour work week came in, so they hired men and other individuals who could work shift time. The food no longer was prepared in the cottage. It was prepared in the kitchen, as I mentioned before, and shipped around to the cottages. And as that transformation took place, so did the education. A school building was built. We'll show you the site of that in a minute. The teachers were in that building rather than in the cottages. The social service people were in this administration building here. So kids moved around the grounds a lot more. And as Glenn indicates, the security in those days was called staff awareness security. It was a responsibility of staff to know where the kids were all the time and to keep them from running away. It didn't mean that we didn't have runaways. We had lots of runaways. When a kid ran away, the fire whistle on this particular building over here would blow. And when that whistle blew, neighbors around would know that a kid was on the loose. They'd run out and take their laundry in and make sure their cars were locked, and then look for the kid. If they found him, they got $5. So we were able to bring kids back. Let's take a look now at some of the other cottage sites as we move around. This is an area obviously well overgrown, but this was a part of the farm layout. This particular building that Glenn's standing by now is what was originally the cannery, where we used to can vegetables. We're talking about a facility now that was practically self-sustaining. It grew its own food, it raised its own animals, it took care of all its maintenance by itself. Very few private contractors came in to do anything here, and that's what kept the cost way down. These places were relatively inexpensive to operate because there was so much child labor and so much of the work was done right here on the grounds. Today, it's very different. I'd hesitate to tell you how much it costs to keep a kid locked up in a facility now, but it was extremely cheap back in the days we're talking about now. So this is an area of the farm. This was the cannery. Over here behind these school buses was the onion field and some of the equipment sheds. Down behind these trees over here that Tim is pointing to or looking at now was the horse barn, the cow barn, piggery, pony barn, chicken houses, all kinds of animals here. When the legislature decided just after the Second World War that it was cheaper to buy food than it was to raise it here, they closed the farm. And the tragedy there was not so much that the farm went, but it took the jobs away that every kid had. And one of the things it took away was the opportunity for kids to interact with animals. We found really in later years that the idea of a pet was one of the major ways to help a kid calm down and to take care of something and be responsible for something. And we eventually convinced the powers to be that we could reestablish the farm, but if we changed the name. Back in the 50s, we were moving into the clinical era. Everything was done by clinicians. And so we coined the name the Pet Therapeutic Farm, and the legislature bought it and let us to go back into business as a farm. Didn't give us any money, but I was able to go out through the churches and raise enough money to bring in a whole herd of Black Angus cattle, some ponies, some chickens, and eventually some Nubian goats, and we became involved in the heifer project, where kids raised animals for the heifer project, that being the system which sent animals to desperate parts of the world where they could get an animal not so much for food but to raise stock. And it is a very successful program. And I'll never forget a day. It was a Christmas Eve I can't give you the exact year, but there was a young man who I was working rather intently with who had never spoken. We had never heard him say a word. His name was Melvin. And Melvin was really attached to Jenny, one of our Black Angus cows, who was pregnant. And I was working in my office on Christmas Eve, and suddenly the door burst open and Melvin came running into the office and said, "Baby, baby, baby." The first words I ever heard him say, and he grabbed me by the arm and he led me down here, and Jenny had calved. And Melvin just stood there with his head on this Black Angus and just cried and cried and cried. It was the best therapy we ever had for that particular kid, and he's done quite well. He's working on farms out in the western part of the state now, probably an old man by now, but Jenny got Melvin to talk.
To expand on Bob's comment about farming and how important it was to get these kids involved in growing food and getting up in the morning and going to a job, having some future. And a lot of these kids were even hired out to some of the farms in the area and worked for farmers. But returned, or they were some of them actually lived on the farm site. And when the state legislature in their infinite wisdom decided to go the clinical way, it removed all of that work ethic and learning experience they got from working the farms and the interaction that they had with people outside of Lyman in the communities, especially the farmers. And so Although they thought they were doing the right thing, they actually weren't. This would have been the way to continue with their programs at Lyman, and kids would have been much more better off, far more better off than what actually happened.
What Tim is showing you now is what is called Oak Cottage. Oak Cottage in its major day was called the Discipline Cottage. We talked about this being an open institution. When a child ran away or did something that he shouldn't have done and needed to be punished, he was put in Oak Cottage. This took him out of activities on the ground. He didn't go to school. He didn't participate in any other activities on the ground. It became a work detail. These kids in Oak Cottage used to work down at the farm. They weeded the fields. They worked in the haymow. They worked with the oxen. They worked just generally manual labor all day long, and then would come back to this cottage. That program lasted for quite a while, and there was always some way to control, or an attempted way to control, kids who were out of control themselves. But eventually this cottage converted itself to become known as the Outward Bound Cottage. We tried an experiment in the early 70s with a federal grant which allowed us to send a select group of kids to Outward Bound, which was a program designed back during the Second World War by the British to try to save some of their merchant seamen who were dying alarmingly rapidly in the ocean, where the older seamen who seemed to have a greater will to live were surviving. And so the British hired a German educator named Kurt Hahn to create a program for them which was short term, but designed to help a person understand how much more potential he had than he thought he had. And so the Outward Bound program is based on the idea of just increasing stress all the time, challenging people to do things they don't think they can do, and simply saying you can do it, encouraging them to do it, and let them to feel what it feels like to be successful. So we applied that, or attempted to apply that, to delinquent kids. And the program was, you came to Lyman for either a year or you went to Outward Bound for 26 days. We took kids out to Ely. I took a bunch out to Ely, Minnesota. Those kids did remarkably well for a period of time out there. There was a mutiny, and eventually I had to go out and pick them up and bring them back. But the majority of the kids did very, very well. And what's exciting about it, and kind of at the same time tragic, is that the recidivism rate, in other words, the amount of time it took for kids to get back in trouble, was drastically reduced by this program, where the kids who had been in the year at the Lyman School were coming back pretty regularly because of future offenses. This cottage is a symbol of how things could change. You go from a disciplined cottage to a cottage where you're really challenging kids to discover how great they can be if they want to be, and if they prove it to themselves, to have them have a chance for success. So we're going to see lots of examples of that as we go around the grounds, opportunities for kids to find out how good they can be. We've now moved up the hill from Oak Cottage, which was right down here. And what we're looking at now is a building which was an all-purpose building. It was the place where we had church on Sunday. Kids were Protestant and Catholic, had to go to church on Sunday. The state provided sport coats, white shirts and ties, and shoes, so that the kids could be respectable when they came to church. In addition to that, it was the place where we had movies and just a general assembly. There's a stage here in the front. They used to put a Christmas pageant on every year. The assistant superintendent ran that. We had a choral group. The band had its concerts in there. It was a general activity building for the school. In the basement was a roller skating rink, and that was a very popular spot. Now torn down just beyond it was the old school building, which was a remarkable building, 4 stories high, school rooms on the first 3 floors. The basement was a gym and a swimming pool, a great swimming pool that was used not only by the Lyman kids, but also open to the town occasionally for town kids to come in. Beyond that, just before the white building, that tree down there, was another building which was the original kitchen building, but the upper floor was where the chaplains were, and then above that was where the band room was, where the kids came to practice a band. We had a marching band here that participated in parades downtown. There are lots of pictures of them around town of the band parading downtown. Up here to the left is Hillside Cottage. Now Glenn has reminded us of what the structure of these cottages were all about. The top floor was the dorm area. All the kids lived in one big open room. The middle floor was for staff rooms, and the bottom floor was where they had school and some other activities. And the basement area was where the kids' lockers were, the bathroom facilities were, the showers, and that sort of thing. And each cottage had that same layout, that same structure. If we look further off to the left, there's a building that looks relatively new, and it is, but it's been a reconverted building. That was the cafeteria, which was built, and it took kids out of the cottage now for meals, and each cottage would go to the cafeteria for its meals. And that was a building that was staffed primarily by a handful of cooks, but majority of it was done by kids. There was one cottage dedicated as the cafeteria cottage, and we'll see that in a moment up the hill. Off here further to the left is a double cottage. This was called Worcester and Wachusett Cottage. It was in time part of the infirmary. It had various uses over the years, but in general it was just a regular cottage like all the rest of them. On the left-hand side with a white foundation is the new school building, or was the new school building. That was built to replace this one the upper floors were condemned, and so that one was put in its place. It was built about the same time as the cafeteria, and that's where the kids went to go to school. What was interesting about that is that you can see the amount of space there is here, and kids had to be roaming the grounds all the time. And the only way you kept track of them, a cottage master would call ahead to say, I'm sending 5 kids up to school, and the school would call back and say, I got your 5 kids. And that's the only way you knew whether you had a runaway or you didn't have a runaway.
How spacious this all is.
Oh, yeah.
It looks like a campus to a very nice school.
Yeah.
And yet, that's the way it was in the earliest times and all the way through to today. And the buildings are extremely well appointed and well constructed. And it was the kids primarily that did all the brickwork, that put on the windows, all the lintels, and the slate and electrical and plumbing were done by professionals because the kids weren't able to do that. But it's amazing that for buildings that were built in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they're still standing. The slate is still on them. It's just neglect now that's
it's a shame.
led us to this level of deterioration.
And as Glenn is pointing out, much of the labor was done by kids. All the lawns that you've seen, and we've got massive amounts of lawn, were all done by hand lawnmowers. It was the new kids who came in. They were generally on a detail line that went out and mowed and mowed and mowed and mowed and mowed. The streets in the early days were shoveled by hand. There's 7 miles of road attached to this facility, and the roads were all shoveled by hand.
Bob was mentioning work details. One of the things that we discovered when we were doing research was when there was a heavy snow down on Milk Street and the trolleys couldn't get through, they would bring all the kids down to shovel out the trolley. Now that was in the late, early 1920s, but that's how they used the kids up here. Keep them busy, keep them working, and keep them involved.
And as Glenn talks about them going down to shovel out the trolley line, we mentioned that there was a power plant down here that provided heat for all the facility. Everything came through tunnels. The fuel for that came from coal, which came into a siding down toward the center of town, and kids would go down with tip carts on a regular basis and haul the coal back to be burned in the power plant to generate the heat for the school.
And in the beginning, when the road became Route 9 in 1930, there was a tunnel built under the road so that the kids could easily cross the road over to the Park Street side, and then with their tip carts or their ox-drawn or horse-drawn vehicles, then go to the siding to pick up the coal or other materials brought in by the train. At some point in time, that tunnel was closed.
All right, let's go on up the hill and take some look at some others. What Tim is showing you now are 2 additional cottages. This was called Sunset Cottage, and the next one down was Westview. The Westview cottage was the cafeteria cottage. Kids who lived in that cottage all worked in the cafeteria. That was their trade. That was what they did all day long, was work, prepare the meals, clean the cafeteria. All the cottages went to the cafeteria for meals. Now think about this. As daylight saving time disappears and darkness comes in the evening, cottage masters would have to line up their kids, 45, 50 kids, by this time the cottages had that many in them, and take them to the cafeteria without losing anybody. And we had some very creative cottage masters who would say to kids, mostly who were coming from Boston and urban areas where they hadn't heard the night noises and the creakiness of the nature around them, would say, stick close together now because we want to be careful of the bears. And we never lost a kid. They'd all huddle together to get to the cafeteria, huddle back.
No, that's for sure. They were in lockstep, weren't they?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
It was like a little military marching order down to the calf.
Yeah.
Prior to that, Bob had said that they ate in. In the very beginning, there was a central kitchen where they prepared all the foods. Then the big meal of the day was lunch, and then the meals were prepared at the central cafeteria. They were put in milk cans and sent up to each of the cottages. So the boys got very minimal breakfast, and then were sent off either to work or school or whatever their job function was. Then when they came back for the noon meal, that was the biggest meal of the day. And then at the end of their work day, when they came back to the cottage, they were given the remainder of what was not eaten at the noon meal, and then they had to go to bed.
Right. And that was a ritual that was really orchestrated by the matron in the cottage. Most of the matrons really wanted the boys to learn good habits, eating habits. So she had cloth napkins, knives, forks, and spoons laid out properly, glasses in the proper spot. Each kid dressed properly for supper or for lunch or whatever the meal was. Decorum at the tables, grace before the meal, and then you could talk but not scream. It was a very congenial kind of time to eat, and all of that got lost in time, and it was kind of too bad, but that was a major part of just helping kids become better boys and girls.
When Bob mentioned that as the calf cottage, there was an integration of age groups in that cottage because there were some boys that weren't physically able to do farm work, to do carpentry work, to do the more strenuous activities that were going on. So a lot of different age groups were in the calf cottage because they were able to be good kitchen help.
There's another cottage behind us. This is called Overlook and Pines. It's divided in half. That was really for the younger boys. It looks out over the majority of the farmland, which we'll go down and take a look at in a minute. All this land down here was farmland. Running along this ridge and down over the hill was the cornfields. Down here on the left-hand side were the orchards, apples, peaches. Further down were hay fields. The truck garden was down closer to the farm itself, where they had onions and broccoli and corn, and lettuces and that sort of thing. This was primarily an agriculture producing facility. It had some animals, some cows, milked, but there was a lot of trading going on between the various facilities. The Westboro State Hospital, the Grafton Hospital, the Lyman School, all traded food back and forth because each was in the business of producing one kind of food or another. Off here to our left was a recreational area where we had our toboggan run and a little obstacle course. And down at the bottom of the hill was a pond. In the little movie we'll show you, you'll see kids skating on the bottom on that pond. It's now all overgrown and it's hard to see now, but it's a beautiful little pond. Down at the end of this road, the road to nowhere as we finally call it, it was built by the state, it didn't go anywhere. But at the very end of it was a cottage called Riverview. And you can see the distance, if you could just imagine how much further down, it's about 3 times as far as we can see. It was that distant from the ground, and the reason for that was that's where the retarded kids were placed. The kids that the people thought were insane or just uneducable, they put them in that cottage. It was a tragic kind of discrimination against those kinds of kids. When some of us came on board, we closed that one down and brought the kids back up on the hill and integrated them into the regular cottages, so they had a better chance of being normal than just being totally segregated and set off to the side and just discarded.
Years later, after that building went vacant and abandoned, a filming crew came in and did a movie in that building called A Close Circle of Friends. And what they did was they blew up the building in the movie. And so nothing remains there now. And then off to the right of that building was a large tin barn.
When that thing blew off, I don't think they realized how much dynamite they had in that thing. It blew up all of Northborough. Remember, you used to have the fireworks here, 4th of July?
Every 4th of July. And it was a great location because everybody could see it.
Sit up here and
for miles around.
Yeah, I've often wondered why we didn't do that more about it.
Historical Powder Hill, Westboro, Massachusetts. It was here the citizens of Westboro built their first meeting house in 1717 at the time of incorporation as the state's 100th town. This hilltop earned its name as the historic site of the town's Gunpowder House, chosen for its elevation and strategic location for defense. Listed in the National Registry of Historic Places, the handsome masonry buildings that now stand were erected as part of the Lyman School for Boys, which relocated here in 1884 and was operational until 1971, when all reform schools in the state closed. This granite slab was part of the old school building that stood on the site for more than a century. As the steward of this property, the Massachusetts Tech Collaborative in 1908 commemorates the historic significance of Powder Hill. MTC is a public agency of the Commonwealth created in 1982 to advance the growth of the state's innovative economy through collaborative activities among industry, universities, and government.
Over the years, there have been many myths and mistales about what happened at Lyman School. To be sure, some very bad things happened. We had some sadistic staff who really harmed kids. But the majority of the staff I want to speak on behalf of. Just think of what they were asked to do. They came to work here in the early days for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They were not permitted to leave the grounds. If they had children of their own, they could not keep them on the grounds, and several families put their children into foster care so they could continue to work here at the Lyman School. It is so easy to trash people, and the legislature and other people have done a remarkable job of doing that. But I want to stand here as one who says these were remarkable people who dedicated major parts of their lives sincerely trying to help disadvantaged, disturbed kids. I celebrate them. I celebrate all that they've done. And one of the things we've learned is through the process is if any change has taken place in a kid's life, it's been because of their contact with better, good people. What you've just seen is the only visual tape or movie that we have of the school back in those days. It's a treasure, and I hope that this DVD, as it's produced here, will allow us in this community to have a permanent record of what this was all about. I apologize for the quality of the tape, but that's the best we could do coming from 1946. So in closing, I simply want to say that there was an awful lot of time spent by the media, by people who knew nothing about it, but people who had big mouths who just shot off their mouth about how rotten Lyman School was, how brutal it was, how many atrocities were committed there. And I make no bones about it. There were people who could only be men among boys, and we had a hard time sometime weeding them out. But we tried the best we could, and the ones that were left were guys who really dedicated their lives to working with some real tough kids. So I want to celebrate them, and I want history to know that the Lyman School did some remarkable things for kids, not because it changed them, not because it was a reformatory, not because it was a training school, but because it provided an environment for them to become part of the community, in but not of the world, at the same time learn the values that they had and all the good things that they could do with life. So I celebrate them, and I want to tell you that I have great admiration. I miss them. I miss the whole facility. I miss what we were able to do there. There's been nothing to replace it in the years that have gone by, as far as I'm concerned, because I was able to see what was happening to real live kids as they turned their lives around. And again, it's not me, it's the staff that was there that did it. And so I celebrate them. So I thank you for looking at this and listening to me spout off about it, but this was the Lyman School as it existed from 1884 up until 1972. Thank you.